So hope things are going well. This is our Q&A for this week. Three questions. So the first is, since Vietnam was divided into a North and South, similar to what happened in Korea, did the Soviets have any hand in assisting or supporting the communist majority in the North acting of its own volition and supplying support to the communists in the South? It's a really good question, and it's an important distinction, I think, between the two conflicts. In Korea, the northern regime was basically an imposed regime. There wasn't a sort of outgrowth of of communist support or anything in North Korea. And ultimately, the North Korean government wasn't and hasn't been a puppet regime only because they sort of played off the Soviets against the communist Chinese. But there was no sense that this is a government which remains arguably the most totalitarian government in the world that had genuine popular support. This is clearly not the case in Vietnam. This is a photo on the screen of the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. This is Ho Chi Minh. The communist forces in Vietnam, sort of like what we saw in Yugoslavia, slightly lesser extent Czechoslovakia during World War II. The communist forces in Vietnam were the leaders of the partisan effort. They did the fighting against the Japanese. The U.S., this organization called the Office for Strategic Services, which was the forerunner to the CIA, had a very cooperative relationship with the Vietnamese communists during the war. If there had been a free election at any point in Vietnam in the late 40s and 50s, the Viet Minh, the communist forces, doubtless would have prevailed. So this was not a case that of the Soviets or the Chinese sort of imposing it. In some ways, it's the reverse. In 1954, when the French decided to pull out, both the Chinese and the Soviets placed pressure on North Vietnam. I should say North Vietnam, I should say the Vietnamese communist leaders, to accept a North Vietnam rather than a unified Vietnam, with the caveat that, we'll have elections in 2 years down the road, because for both the Soviets and the Chinese, they viewed Vietnam as less significant than maybe finding a way to sort of accommodate the French. And then with regards to the situation in South Vietnam, this is entirely the initiative of the North. It's not the Soviets are sort of pressuring them to act. And one of the interesting things I think about the war in the late 50s and early 60s is that the South Vietnamese communists, they're organized in a group called the National Liberation Front, the NLF. They're South Vietnamese, so it's true they want a unified Vietnam. It's true they basically accept the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, but they're indigenous. They have their own interests. There are tensions between northern communists and southern communists. So it's a very, very different kind of conflict than Korea in terms of the breadth of popular support for the communists. And one of the reasons I think why the U.S. loses Vietnam and wins Korea is that no one in Korea wants to live under the North regime, but the communists in Vietnam have a level of actual popularity, and the U.S. can never really outflank them on the national front. Second question: did foreign policy play any role in Kennedy's win in 1960? This is hard to say. It was such a close election in 1960. You can argue that maybe anything would have, anything might have made the difference. But I think looking back, sort of with some hindsight, what's striking is how little the difference was between Kennedy and Nixon. Both were basically running as hardline Cold Warriors. And in the Kennedy-Nixon debates, 1960 is the first time there are debates between the presidential candidates during an election. In the 1960 presidential debates, it's Kennedy who brings up foreign policy repeatedly, and he attacks Nixon from the right, arguing that the Eisenhower people hadn't done enough, had sort of seen the communism advance during Eisenhower's presidency. This is an excerpt from the second debate, where Kennedy was basically accusing the Eisenhower administration of having lost Cuba to the communists. Nixon kind of defends here, and one of the incredible things about this name, no one would accuse Richard Nixon of being an ethical, man in politics. But what Nixon knew is that the Eisenhower administration had begun to develop this covert operation plan, which then later became the Bay of Pigs, but couldn't reveal this in a debate, because if he revealed it, it would no longer be covert. So Kennedy's attacking him for not doing enough with regards to Cuba, and Nixon ultimately chooses to put the country's interests over his own and remains silent. Similarly, on nuclear weapons, Kennedy argues, falsely it turns out, for the existence of what he calls a missile gap in the 1960 campaign. He says that Eisenhower hasn't done enough to build up U.S. defenses, and as a result has allowed the Soviets to take the lead over the U.S. And Soviets did not have the lead over the U.S. in 1960 with regards to missiles, but it's kind of this particular demagogic campaign. So this is it's the last election until arguably 2016, depending on how you want to interpret Trump Clinton, in which the Democratic candidate is more pushing for more sort of military action, aggressive security responses to international affairs than the Republicans. This will change. We'll look at this next week in the snippets. In 1964, the Republicans nominated a very, very conservative senator named Barry Goldwater, who attacks LBJ from the right, and this is sort of the pattern from here on out. But in 1960, Kennedy is attacking Nixon from the right, arguing that the Eisenhower-Nixon administration hadn't done enough to confront communism, especially outside of Europe. And then the last question: was there any involvement by the U.S. in Laos before the 1963 documents? Yes, so remember we had that reading where the U.S. Kennedy was considering possibly expanding into Laos. So here's the kind of map of the war. Laos is this country in kind of red pink here. The shaded areas, by the way, that you see on this map, here in Laos, in Cambodia, in portions of South Vietnam, these are areas that will come under the control or the de facto control of the North Vietnamese by the end of the war. So I like this map because it also it helps show how the other parts of of Southeast Asia are absorbed into the conflict. But in response to the question, yes, the U.S. had been involved in Laos before the 63 threat. And the key figure here was the man here on the left of the screen, Averell Harriman, who really should have been Secretary of State under Kennedy, and Kennedy kind of acknowledges it later on. But Kennedy was big when he got elected on this idea of young and vigorous, and Harriman, the perception was that he was too old. And so Harriman accepts Kennedy's appointment to be Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs, which for him was a step down. He had been ambassador to Russia ambassador to the Soviet Union during World War II, then had been governor of New York in the 1950s, had been sort of a major player in Democratic politics nationally. So he's taking this kind of very, very subordinate position in the State Department. And Vietnam is largely outside of his bailiwick, even though it's in East Asia, it's under the control of defense. But he looks at events in Laos, and in Laos there was a civil war occurring in the early 1960s between a kind of a right-wing anti-communist faction within the military, a pro-North Vietnamese communist faction, and a neutralist faction headed by a prince named Savannah Phuma. And what Harriman argues is that a neutralist approach for the U.S. is perfectly acceptable in the Cold War. That the U.S. goal should be to ensure that other countries do not become communist. If they're neutral, Harriman says that's fine, and he presses forward on this diplomatically from 1961 into early 1962. He keeps making the argument it's the U.S. should not be backing these anti-communist forces within Laos because they're not politically strong enough. He argues that if the U.S. goes with Savannah Phuma, you might get a kind of more stable, neutral regime, and through kind of effective diplomacy, he's able to persuade the Soviets as well, who were the chief sponsors sponsors of the communist force in Laos, a group called the Pathet Lao, that everyone's interests would be better served by cooling the temperature in Laos, which was a country that really had been beyond the scope of U.S. foreign policy until very, very late in the Eisenhower administration, when Eisenhower started worrying about these North Vietnamese supply routes through Laos. And so Harriman succeeds in 1962. There's an international agreement in Geneva, Switzerland. All sides, the U.S., the Soviets, agree to support a unified neutralist government of Laos. Now that government is going to collapse because of the strains of the Vietnam War. The U.S. will become much more involved militarily in Laos in the late 1960s. But for a period, this approach of kind of neutralism seemed like a good option. And in retrospect, it's one of the great unanswered questions of the Kennedy administration. Even though the outcome in Laos was that the anti-communists did not take power, neutralist force took power, there was no domestic blowback here at all for the Kennedy administration in terms of backing this. And in retrospect, they very easily could have done a similar thing in Vietnam. Said, look, Ho Chi Minh is going to make assurances X, Y, and Z. There's not going to be a Soviet satellite. We have demonstration of this. We had a pre-existing relationship with them during World War II. So we're going to apply this neutralist sentiment to Laos as well, and agree that Laos, Cambodia, and a unified Vietnam will be neutralist. But they never take that approach. They basically separate Laos and Cambodia, where the U.S. does promote a neutralist regime in both cases, from Vietnam, where they never entertain the idea of neutralism in the conflict. So that's it for the questions for this week. Hope everyone is well and has a good weekend. Talk to you soon.